on the Zionist movement and its future leaders. It's part of the annual conference of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. From Washington, this is Just About an Hour.
Lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having us here, ladies and gentlemen. We have a wonderful Israeli and very diverse panel today. And together we're going to grapple with many of the key issues facing Israeli society. Where are we going? What are the challenges? We'll try and look at the post-war reality nationwide and especially in the north. How is the economy coping? How is our education system faring and so on? How are we grappling with immigration? Some issues relating to the army, Jewish-Arab relations within Israel and so on. We're going to use our panelists' very personal involvement in many of these issues to try and give you a real sense of how Israel is faring in these fields. There's a program on Israel television called Politica. Some of you have probably seen it. Whenever it's on in our house, my wife makes me turn the television down. It's Israelis engaged in political argument, but often at the same time as each other. So it's kind of hard to hear what they're saying. The idea of this panel is not Politica, you'll be relieved to hear. So let's start with the post-war reality. Uzi, maybe I'll start with you. Generally, how do you think the country is grappling with the post-Lebanon reality? Has our confidence in ourselves been restored? Are we making progress in that direction?
Well, like all crises and wars, they have all kind of effects. Some are... Can you hear me? Well, maybe the microphone doesn't work. I'll try and shout. All wars and crises usually expose many, many things, some of which are immediate and some less so. It seems to me that some of the difficulties that were exposed by the last war, which will be discussed later, for example, the way the North was organized, how society was organized, all of that is being addressed. But what I think Israel is now going through are some of the secondary effects of the crisis, things which are now only coming to the fore and are complicating the crisis in a way that is not quite clear that the crisis indeed is over. To give you just one example, there is growing tension with Syria, which is clearly a product of that war. It is an unanticipated product of that war, but it will characterize the next few months and years. So I don't think it's all over, but at the same time, two things should be observed. One was already noticed in these segments that we just saw. First, when it comes to the grassroots response, the people response, the youth, be it in the army, be it in the rear, be it in all over the place, the country is doing extremely well. The resilience manifest by even these two young ones who just came and addressed us is also true all over the place. In that sense, there was no crisis. The Israeli performed brilliantly in the war when it came as fighters, and many have shown many of the qualities for which Israel has always excelled. So on this level, the grassroots level, things are going well. Where problems do remain is on the level which is above it, namely national policy, the functioning of the machinery, the political system, and all kind of structures whose flaws had been exposed by the war. The political system, the educational system, and other systems. So we have still a very, very big challenge ahead of us, although we are coping with some of the more immediate ones.
Right, very good. Eliezer, specifically up north in terms of rebuilding and reviving the country, what can you tell us about what's going on?
If I may first relate to what Uzi said, I must quote the late Prime Minister Rabin, and I'm honored to be with you here today. Late Prime Minister Rabin once said, Israel had only one war in its history, and this is the War of Independence. But the story is that this war is not over yet. And in a way, we are living through this ups and downs in this war. If I may personally, the last war that I participated in was in 1982. And this war, my son was a squadron commander of F-16I in the Air Force with 55 missions. And as he was doing that, I was traveling in the north. And as Uzi said, the main problem was that the infrastructure of the different municipalities didn't function, And this is where civic society had to step forward. And volunteers such as Seth and others who are actually trying to recoup the economy there. What we're seeing it on the surface, it starts to work. It starts to work. The businesses are taking off again. Tourism is back in full, you can hardly find a room for Pesach in the north. But under the surface, and by this I will conclude my opening remarks, it's very interesting. These days in Israel, the most popular movie that just came out is the story of the Bufor. This is the story, those of you who don't know, is the story of the soldiers who were in a stronghold in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, this mountain called Bufor. It tells a story that happened 10 years ago. And it's only now that the Israeli society is ready to deal with what happened then. I'm not sure that the Israeli society is ready psychologically to deal with what happened last summer. We still have to do the work to deal with the political issues that are very, very serious, and to get the people together by engaging them, because this war represented a very, I would say, scary disengagement of different parts of the Israeli society.
Dalia Rodman, do you want to come in on this and talk about sort of where Israeli society stands now?
I would like to add that this war, above all, exposed the gaps within Israeli society, the inability of part of societies to deal with what happened in the north, and there were those who could afford and those who could not afford to run away from the north to some other places. And not talking about infrastructure problems, shelters missing, inappropriate organizing of the local communities in the north. And I would like to take what my friend Yari said about my father, that there was one war and all the rest is other phases. I don't think that he really thought so when he was trying to make peace. And every war is a wake-up call for the Israeli society. It's a wake-up call that about our flaws, about what we have to deal with. And I think that maybe now we start coping with the assassination 10 years later. And as Yari said, we haven't been coping yet with the last war. What is very important to say is that Israeli society is not accepting anything as Torah Mishamayim. We want explanations. People don't want to send their children to the war without asking questions, without getting explanations, and without accountability. We want accountability. And this is something which is strengthened, I think, after this war.
It's very interesting. Over and over you hear in Israel, partly because of the flaws of our political system, that there's actually no Hebrew term for accountability. There's achrayut, which is responsibility. I had a conversation with the president of the Hebrew University a few weeks ago, and he said, well, actually there is now. We've kind of come up with this word, achrayutiyut, which is really beyond translation, but maybe means the beginning of something like accountability, and maybe we're moving towards a society that is demanding more accountability. So Efrat, you're in the hot seat, you're in government, and you have been responsible for, very practically on the ground, developing of the north and the Negev and so on. What can you tell us about the progress that's being made?
First of all, I feel that I can't talk about what happened in the war without saying a big thank you to the crowd sitting here, for your generous donations, really helped, and contribution who helped us recover the Galil and the Negev. Thank you so much for what you did. We couldn't have done it without you. And I'd also like to say, thank you. I'd also like to say that I came here a few years ago with Shimon Peres, my boss, to the AIPAC meeting. And I really felt a lot of admiration for this event. But now I really applaud AIPAC members, the board, the president, the general director, because I see here so many young leaders, so many young generation who's come forth, and I think this really needs to be applauded, and thank you so much for your great work. So putting this aside, I'll start with what you say. I think that the war was really a wake-up call for us, as Dalia said before. But this was also a wake-up call for the need to help the Negev and the Galil, to help us build and develop the Negev and the Galil. First of all, we found out in this war, in the Lebanon war, that the real front is a home front. The resilience of the civilian society was our victory. I can tell you about my hero in the war, my grandmother. She's about to turn 86. She fled Czechoslovakia just before the Nazis took over. And she was near Haifa, in a place near Haifa. She was shelled and rocketed in her home day in and day out, sometimes for 25 times a day. She had to run for shelter. And we begged her to come to the center of Israel to stay with us. And she said, no way. I passed through all the wars. I'm not going to defeat on this one. So this was really the resilience of our society. We need to make the Negev and the Galil a frontier, a place where people can live in. This is our real home front in the wars to come. We have to make it a strong place. Second, the Negev and the Galil are actually, the center of Israel is actually crowded, very expensive. The population is growing now. We need to disperse the population. The population is growing. We need to have our assets not located in the center of Israel, but all over in the Negev and the Galil, so we won't be so vulnerable. We've just started now in relocating the army from the center of Israel to the south. Already the Air Force is now moving over. We're going to see in the next few years thousands of soldiers coming over to live in the Negev. This is one thing we're doing. Another thought is that most of the non-Jewish population is actually situated in the Negev and the Galil. This is our opportunity to invest in them and actually have better ties and cooperation with our population inside to form a better society. And last but not least is the question of the younger generation, as we saw here before. This is a time that we have to ask ourselves, what challenges should we represent our youth with? And I'm speaking about youth, of Jewish youth abroad. And we believe that the Negev and the Galil could be a new edition of Israel, an edition of hope, of technology, of modern science, of great employment. This is what we're trying to do now in the Negev, in the Galil, in forms of the various things like building now a new university in the northern part of Israel, in the Galil. We're talking about bringing high tech to the Negev and to the Galil, putting a lot of efforts in educational skills for the Negev and for the Galil, because we believe that this is our main ability. Without the Negev and the Galil, there is no future for the state of Israel.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? We're talking about the Negev and the Galil as if they are these remote, distant areas. Now, all of you, I suspect, are not fooled by that. The distances are so short, and therefore, we had a war up north. Well, I live in Jerusalem. It was an hour away. There is trauma on the Gaza-Sderot border. Again, from Jerusalem, you're talking about an hour's drive. These are not remote, inaccessible areas that we would like to galvanize and get the best out of. The potential is extraordinary. Seth, as somebody who, I think you should tell people here what you actually did immediately after the war, as somebody who was very hands-on in the north in helping businesses that were immediately and directly affected by the impact of that conflict. Tell us what the challenges that you faced were and how you're grappling with them. Tell us a little about Project Nimratz.
Okay, thank you. Everything that was said up until now is very poignant, and I think that you will get a feeling for the different voices around the crisis in the summer. For me, just before I get into Israel Critical Capital and Project Nimratz, to me it was a wake-up call around meaning, more of an existential exercise than a political or a military exercise. Words that the State of Israel was founded on, like war, like peace, independence, liberation, economy, charity, philanthropy, those words need new definitions today, and that's not only in Israel. Israel is not an isolated island in the world. We're all part of a global village. What war means to the United States today is different than what it meant in World War II or in Vietnam. What war this summer meant for us up in the north, it was very different than what the word war meant in 1967. And the word peace has a different connotation today than it did then. And I think that we're all facing a crisis of meaning, in a sense, and that what the younger generation needs to do is to come with a new lexicon to give definition to these words to allow us to move ahead. And I think that that's the challenge for endeavors in any area in Israel and maybe in the world. Israel Critical Capital Foundation is a philanthropic foundation that I founded about 5 years ago before the war in Lebanon. And what we try to do is to address the gap in the Israeli society and in the economy specifically between the capital markets, the banks, and the small and medium-sized companies in the country. And we saw this as a great challenge to help Israel get on track and to make it stronger through the strengthening of what are the majority of businesses and the majority of people in the country. We were working in a program in the north, in the Galil, before the war, and when the war broke out, we were faced with the challenge or the decision, should we stop our program and pack up, or should we continue, and how would we continue? And what we did, and to the credit of the people that work for me, we spent the war, the whole month, up in Rosh Pinah. We took over a bed and breakfast completely because there were no tourists and no guests. And we set up communications in their bomb shelter. And we worked diligently to try to adapt our program for what we anticipated the day after the war would be, to try to help companies from going under, to try to help them sustain and build them towards growth. And we were successful in that several days after the war, we opened our doors of Project Nimratz, and we're based in Rosh Pinah. Today, the foundation has over 60 people in the north in Project Nimratz. We have hundreds of businesses that have come through our doors and that we help. And in our view of the world and our view of philanthropy is a more holistic approach, and we're not about giving loans, and I think it was misrepresented in the introduction. We're not a fund to provide charitable loans. We're not venture philanthropy, but we're facilitators to try to help companies get better in order to lead them in a better path to stability. And so far the project's been very successful.
In a sentence, companies that were directly affected last summer have rebounded, are rebounding, or were broken?
Yes, and yes. And yes. One of the big results, or the major result that we saw up in the north in the small and medium-sized businesses, and that's our sweet spot. We're talking about businesses that have between 5 and 50 employees, not the very big companies. In Israel, 50 employees is called a medium-sized company, and I know in America it's a little different. These companies experienced a gaping hole in their cash flow due to the war. If you went up in the north during the wars, it sounds like all of us have been up there, it was a ghost town. The residents left, the banks were closed, there was no money in the ATMs, the supermarkets were shut down. So the small businessman had a gaping hole. He had no business at all for 30 days of the war. He probably bought inventory anticipating the summer before the war. That's 30 days back. So he's got 30 before, 30 of the war. He comes back home. Carmiel is blown away, thousands of shells. Does he have any business the first month? Probably not either. That's 90 days. It gets a little bit back on track. He's got between 90 and 120 days of a hole in his business cash flow. That's what people were faced with. The challenge for Nimratz was to tell those businesses to hold on. I tell my consultants, I say, don't just do something, stand there. Don't take a loan right away when you're in a crisis position. Don't start to take the philanthropic loans and being offered immediately. Wait and let's look. And we tried to guide businesses out of that hole with some composure, with some tools that we provide to bring them what we thought was a better future. The North has rebounded. People are in the streets, people are doing business, but each business in their own has that hole and is carrying it along with them. Each business, how they are stabilizing and recovering is a story in itself.
Okay, terrific. I want to come back to something that Efrat mentioned in terms of the challenge of developing the Negev and the Galilee, where many of Israel's non-Jewish citizens live. And that's a challenge that Israel has always been grappling with. And I suspect we're going to have a very diverse range of opinions about the future of relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and how Israel is meeting the challenge of dealing with that relationship. Uzi, I'll come to you first for your sense. Given some of the statements that the Israeli Arab community's leaders themselves are making about how they see their future in the State of Israel.
Before responding to this, let me just complete something that you mentioned. Look, we can look at all the positives and all the drivers that could help us as we recover from this, but we should also be very honest into admitting that many of our problems are self-inflicted. And one way of correcting those things is correcting those things that cause the problem. Just to give you one example, you alluded to the absence of word for accountability in Hebrew, achayutiyut. I'll tell you that we had another problem in Israel, that of competence, and there isn't a word, an exact word in Hebrew for competence. But competence is what we need. And if you just notice that in the last few weeks, we had instances of people falsifying their resumes and appointments of people who are certainly underqualified in terms of competence. Until we rectify those problems, we will not be able to accomplish all we have to do. Now, we do have to accomplish a great deal because of what you just alluded to, the problem from within, which we are very reluctant to admit to. It is no coincidence that this year, for the first time, in an almost organized way, the Israeli Arab citizens have placed on the table their official positions, essentially all denying the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. You had one manifesto called the Vision. You have a constitution draft that was tabled by others. You have another one which is about to be produced by intellectuals. And these are the mainstream of the Israeli Arabs. That's not the fringe of the fundamentalist group. All of them are unanimous on claiming that Israel, as it was constituted as a Jewish state, as it was established by the Declaration of Independence, as it was recognized by the Community of Nations, is unacceptable to them. They accept the state of Israel, but they would like it to change completely. That is a major political challenge from within. It will haunt us. It is not predicated on the argument that they are being deprived. It is leveled there even if their socioeconomic conditions would be equal or surpass those of the Jews. Their grievances and political claims are still placed there. Now, why am I disturbed by that? Because as if we did not have enough problems, now we have that problem. That problem essentially prevails in the north, in the Galil, in the Negev. We cannot ignore it. It will haunt us in so many other ways because it coincides with another hardening of Palestinian position, the rise of Hamas to power last year. Mind you, the Israeli Arabs refer to themselves as Palestinians. So we cannot, ostrich-like, avoid that reality that there is a kind of a confluence at a time in which some world leaders, in a very vulgar fashion, talk about wiping the state of Israel off the map, when some anti-Semites allude to the fact that Israel maybe should revisit the issue of its existence, when we have the Hezbollah, of course, their positions are well known, and the Hamas assuming power, with Fatah edging towards the Hamas, refusing to recognize Israel or its Jewishness, we have our own basar mi basarenu, Israeli citizens now saying, yes, we are citizens, but essentially we want, I don't want to use the word subvert, we want to change structurally the very foundation of the Zionist states. So if you ask yourself, is the Zionist spirit still around? That will be responded to by the response that the Jewish community of Israel, as the majority, practicing its right for self-determination, will present to that most ominous of internal challenges.
Let me take this to the rest of the panel. Do you share the bleak assessment? And if so, or depending on how you see it, how should we respond? Dalia, please.
I want to react to the apocalyptic description of Uzi Arad which is basically reality, but I don't agree that there's nothing to be done, and I think that it is a result of long-going depriving the Israeli Arabs budget-wise. And we did it all along, all governments except one, and we created social-economic real gap and problems. In the Rabin Center, I can tell you that we are trying to cope with it by bringing children from Arab villages and giving them the opportunity to go through a semester in the university, to encourage them to finish their studies and go to the university. Unless you take Avigdor Lieberman's policy and you want to transfer all of them and make swaps and exchanges, we have to find a way to coexist with them and try and bring them up and bring them to the state that they will feel in a way not equal but at least equal citizens of the Israeli state. And there is a lot to be done, and there is a lot that is being done, and we don't have to give up about that.
Eliezer, I assume that through the New Israel Fund, some of the things that Dalia Rabin was referring to are being done in projects that you're behind.
Absolutely, and I must say that I'm honored to head the New Israel Fund in Israel, because this is a place where the different voices are getting to talk to one another. Sometimes we forget what democracy is all about, and when people ask me what is the New Israel Fund all about, I said this is about empowering the different voices so they could represent themselves in the public discourse that's going to decide the future of the state of Israel. And the vision paper is definitely disturbing. It's disturbing, but it's clearly, as Dalia said, it's a result of long years of discrimination against the minority for reasons that are understood. But it's, just say oive doesn't mean that you cannot do anything. And I think one of the things that we have to do is, beside empowering, is actually see, and I think all the prime ministers, including Netanyahu, were very much aware to the fact that we have to invest in the different parts of the Israeli communities, in the periphery and other places, so that there will be more equality in the different parts, and this will ensure the future of the state of Israel. Let me just share with you a little story from the war. We were giving emergency funds, like many of the other organizations during the war, and we gave emergency funds to Arab organizations that represented grassroots groups. One of them was a group of Arab psychologists in Israel, because they had to give first aid to people in Kafar Kara, in Merar, in different areas. So after the war, I went to visit them, and I met a young man, 30 years old, psychologist, and I said, so what did you do with the money? And he explained to me, and I said, I want to tell you a story. He said, the only Arab organization of psychologists that exists in the world is in Israel. There isn't an organization of psychologists in Egypt, in Syria, in Jordan. The only place that exists, it's in Israel. I said, how many are you? He said, 310. I said, what? 310 psychologists? Yes. How comes? Then we link together. Why? Because they call the golden age of the Arab minority in Israel the time of the Prime Minister Rabin, who actually opened the opportunities and they reallocated funds to the Arab community. And one of the things that happened is that at that time, the government decided to have a psychologist in every school. And the New Israel Fund appealed to the Supreme Court that if you're doing that, why don't you do it in Arab schools as well? And the government said, you know what, we accept it. So demand was created, and now there is a psychologist in every school, in every Arab school. So there is a new infrastructure of intellectuals, and this is a result of equal allocation. I think that we have to stand to the challenge of the vision paper. I think that we have to look into our own vision of the state of Israel. We have to see how we do it with 250,000 people who are non-Jews in Israel, who live in Israel. We have to look at them. We have to look at how we integrate seriously the most prominent community of Russians in Israel, those who actually create the future of the state of Israel today, that live in the periphery. And one of them is the Arab minority of the state of Israel.
Okay, well let's, by all means, if I just let me fashion another question, and then maybe you can comment on the both. So we've spoken about one particular sector where you've said we are in a way starting to pay a price for underfunding and poor treatment. But we have one of the issues that we are unquestionably grappling with in Israel is the increasing sense of a society of haves and have-nots. We're not just talking about between Jews and Arabs, we're talking about a top 10%, if you like, of the Israeli income, which is vastly colossal, and a gap that is expanding, I think, faster than in any other Western country between the bottom 10%. And not only that, you have between that a lot of people where you have even two breadwinners and even people in responsible positions and responsible employment who can't get through the month. How are we, I put this to any of you, but Efrat, if you want to go first, how is Israel grappling with those economic divides that go across all sectors of Israeli society?
I'd like to start first with the Arab question you just raised before. I totally agree with Dalia and with Yaari, and we'll start with the facts. The facts are that in the Galil, almost 52% of the population in the Galil are non-Jewish. In the Negev, almost 25% of the populations are Bedouins, which means that this is not a problem that you can swipe under a rug and forget about it. We have to do something about it, and we have to do it right now. And this is a problem that I think we can deal by being strong and also by being just and doing the right thing. And as Jewish people, we should do the right thing. And the right thing for us is empowering the use of economic help, employment. As the only member actually of the government here, in Israeli terms, I'm in a lose-lose position, but I can still tell you that what we're doing, what our office is trying to do now, is actually close the gap between the Jewish sector and non-Jewish sector in the Galil and in the Negev. We're putting special funds for employment, for infrastructure, for housing, for schooling, things that were left behind for so many years. And we believe that this is our last chance to try and to work it out. You were referring also to the problem, to the gap between the rich and the poor in Israel. And this is a problem that we're starting to address very clearly these days. It's a great problem. And as I think Dalia said before, people who had money to leave left, and people in the north during the war, and people who had to stay there in shelters, sometimes in very poor conditions. And I believe that this is the thing that we have to do right now in order to close the gaps. I think we should do it especially through education. Education in Israel is free of charge, but we have to make it free of charge also through universities. This is the most important thing for us to do, because through university a person can have a global understanding of the economy. Through university a person can actually leap over the gap and can do things they cannot do otherwise. And I think this should be our biggest investment that we're trying to work on right now.
If I may,
yeah, please.
One more.
Let me steer you as well to talk about a little bit about education too. It's as a parent of kids who are at various stages of their schooling. It's dismaying sometimes the limitations of our education system. I don't know how plugged into the news by the hour you've been, because you've been listening to speakers here, but we're in the midst of another flurry of education strikes. I don't think my kid's going to school tomorrow. He's in 9th grade. It's coming up to exam time,
Universities
we're in some trouble here. Are we funding education sufficiently? Are we spending money in the wrong directions? Maybe you can talk about that a little as well. Yes.
I will. I'm not an expert about education, but try, and the fund is trying. But I think the social and economic gap is not just a matter of economic ideology. This is something that touches, I think, the most important nerve of the Israeli society, which is the sense of ownership and the responsibility to the other. In a society that is struggling in a constant war, that the bus driver who gets into the bus in the morning doesn't know how the day is going to end, and the mother whose son is in Lebanon, if what comes with this is a feeling that they are inferior to the other, that their school is worse than the school in Tel Aviv, and they are second class. This is when people are getting disengaged from the center and disengaged from responsibility. And there is something that I worry about as, let's say, as a second generation to Holocaust survivors, and my son is in the military as a commander. It's this disengagement. That people will start saying, it's not mine. It's not my responsibility. I grew up in a neighborhood that all of us grew up into the fact that we have to take responsibility. Like her father, like anybody here as the new immigrants. When you see the new generation, when you see this look in the eyes that say, it's not mine, I don't care, this is when I start worrying. So the social economic gap is a luxury that we cannot afford. Therefore, the investment in education is no doubt an investment for the future. The thing that I was involved in is engaging high-tech people. Your brother, who is sitting here with us, was one of them. The venture capitalist that started, Seth, was one of them, that actually brought their expertise and experience into the education system. Now there's a new minister, Professor Yuli Tamir, I think, who is very dedicated and devoted to the issue, but there is no doubt the responsibility of the different municipalities to education is not clear. They have to be much more involved, because we are now enjoying what happened last year in the economy is actually what came into reality is mainly the investment on the Aliyah. The Russian treasure that we got back in the 90s came into real by fantastic growth. The growth of 20 years from now is in education. And this is why the situation is so sensitive right now, and it's clear that the next major investment should be in education.
Efrat, you wanted to respond to something.
Yes, I beg to differ about the spirit in Israel. And from where I stand, from where we stand, I see a different tone in Israel.
The thing, it's growing.
I'm talking about the spirit, and I see a different spirit altogether, and I want to tell you about it and share it with you. I see the spirit of a lot of new NGOs, non-political NGOs, who are starting to grow in Israel. Thousands of individuals who are beginning to be involved in social matters, which want to be involved in the future of Israel and do not take money to do it. This is one of their most important missions in their life. I want to talk about the young people, like the Ayalim we just saw now, people that we see a lot of them going to work in the Negev and Galil. It's actually now a huge trend for thousands of young people who finish the army, and instead of going to high-tech or going to start being millionaires on their way, they want to do educational work. They're going into very poor cities, into very poor towns, and they're staying in there and doing amazing educational work. They're working with the poor. They're making a change. And this change does not make them millionaires. This change makes them very rich in spirit. We see it going on. We love it. It's absolutely awesome what we see going on now in Israel. And it's a new thing coming on. We embrace it. And we see it everywhere. It's nothing to do with religion. You do it, religious people, secular people, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim. Everywhere you see this trend going on, and I think this shows us a lot about the spirit going on in Israel, the spirit of involvement and doing for the community.
Daria, you wanted to add something?
No doubt that we have wonderful youth, and if they are being called to the army, they go and they serve and they fight tremendously great. They bring the good. No doubt that we have a lot of volunteers. No doubt that there is a lot of work being done by NGOs. But this is not a national spirit. The gap, I know the numbers of the wonderful economy, But the tremendous gap between the so little that have so much more and between those so many that are beyond the poverty line, it will have its effect. It's a bubble, and it will explode in the future. And we cannot build our future on volunteering and NGOs. It has to be national led, and this is our problem. The education is not led by the leadership. We don't have leadership in education. The education is not the first of the priority of the government. It's not crystal clear that we are now investing most of the budget in the future, in research. It's not crystal clear. We are still investing in war making. And I think the last war is as early as it is to cope with overall influence. And we are still dealing with the very beginning of the outcome, psychologically especially, because there was a national trauma in the North. And to the extent that I think we've never witnessed before, because of the gaps, because of people that were not capable and were not equipped to cope with those days of shelling, that they couldn't run away. We saw pictures of people in Kiryat Shmona that were sitting in the street because they had no shelters and they had nowhere to go. So, do we want to have a Jewish state based on Jewish values? So we have to hurry up and invest in education and supply education to everybody from the Ministry of Education, from the government budget, and not NGOs taking over. It can't be run by spontaneous initiatives. It has to be organized by the state.
The question is, at the same time as Israel is grappling with its security threats and has its primary obligation as a government to protect its citizens, whether there is nonetheless allocations that should be directed to education and that are not being. I mean, if resources are being sent to the wrong areas, I think most. You want to weigh in on that? I think few Israelis would feel confident about directing money away from security issues to education, but I think a lot of Israelis would wonder if there are other areas of allocation that should be redirected towards education.
I just remind you something that James Carville said. It's the economy, stupid. And that's what it is, in my view. It's the economy, stupid. The capital markets in Israel, you talk about the gap, and I wish that there'd be a rule that each time they would publish the statistics of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, they would have to publish the poverty numbers. And each time they would talk about the good credit rating that Israel has been granted by Moody's, they would talk about the average monthly wage in Israel, which just went up to a whopping 7,500 shekels, which is maybe $1,600 a month. So they're not poor, those people, they're average. The poor people make less than $1,600 a month in Israel. The beacon, Israel, the seat of high tech, Israel. The secret is, the dirty secret is, that the capital markets in Israel have plenty of money. And the model for that is not new. Israel didn't invent it. In America, you had Rockefeller, Morgan, Frick, names I'm sure you're familiar with. And then these guys were doing very, very well, and they control the capital markets. In America, then, you had the Small Business Administration that helped bring money from the capital markets down to smaller companies. Israel has their share of those types of families that do control the capital markets. So models that come in, the cycle of economic good with educational good is a natural cycle. You can see it in Ireland. In Ireland, it was a 20-year planning horizon. Israel has to get off of the Band-Aid. It has to get off of, let's put some budget here and budget there. It needs to give itself a vision and then give itself the time to see that vision be played out and to correct it. You talk about accountability. Well, accountability, transparency are only as good as the systems and as the information that goes in, and then the ability to change along with it. And I think that motivations of the economy, economic incentives that can be built into educational incentives, educational programs are very important. In Israel Critical Capital, we're a philanthropic organization, but our strategy is to shake the tree of the capital market. It's not to give charity and charitable loans as the end game. That's a model that came from Europe. That's the pushka on the table. Give money, give to the Free Loan Society, give to Hayas, give to Karen Kayemet, keep putting in the money. But now Israel grew this whole new thing. It's called a capital market. It's called banks. It's called very wealthy individuals. So it's no longer, it's not just an NGO and it's not just the government, because those have their own models. But incentives around moving money from above to below, I believe, can help the economic and the educational cycle to grow, but it needs to be in a long-term sense.
I just want to, if you like, play devil's advocate here a little bit, or at least to ask you, are we not underestimating some of the challenges that Israel has had to grapple with and has grappled with extraordinarily well? Are we not losing track of the degree to which we had a national imperative to absorb basically 1/6 of our own population again in the past 15, 16, 17 years? Have we not devoted essential resources to areas like that? And were those not essential things that we had to do? And let me elaborate on the question a little bit. How have we done in terms of that immigration absorption effort? Is not that something where certainly you already mentioned, Eliezer, in terms of high tech, in terms of the economic benefit that we reaped, is this not something that was an acute priority and that we grappled with pretty well?
It definitely was. I must tell you a personal story. I had to go through an operation last year. It was okay. It was herniated disc. I couldn't get through this operation without the Russian aliyah. Thanks you, Gorbachev, for doing that for me. Because the anesthesian was Russian, the nurse was Russian, the person who pushed my bed was Russian, the guard at the door was Russian. The only person who was not Russian was the doctor who started to study Russian because he cannot continue working without the Russian. So every time I think about it, I said, thank you, Gorbachev, because he was the last Zionist was Gorbachev, because he basically, somebody gave me the numbers. The numbers are between $4 and $5 billion of higher education only. That was given to Israel on a year.
You mean that was the value of the education that the immigrants brought with them?
Then I think the two first administration, it's Shamir and then late Prime Minister Rabin, put tremendous amount in construction, mainly in the Beersheba area, Nazrat, Illit, Haifa, Yokneam, that actually supported the high tech and the industry and created jobs. It means the number of jobs during this time is enormous. Now, this community, and this is where I'm becoming more and more Zionist, it's because it's exciting to see people that came from nowhere, basically, that have to reinvent their Judaism, reinvent themselves as free citizens, reinvent themselves as living in democracy, and it works. One little remark. I went to visit the Air Force Base in the south when my son is, and he told me that in his squadron, 54% of the soldiers are Russians. 54. And this is when we are talking about new generation. The young generation in Ramat HaSharon area, less than 50% are going to the military today. The percentage among Russians who go to the military is reaching 100%, because it's part of their building their Israeliness. So the contribution is fantastic. I think the Israeli society also raised tremendous contribution and sacrifice to do that. It means more children in schools, more people in Kupat Cholim at the same time, more people on the streets, people who do not speak the language. But as of now, I think what we're seeing in the economy, what we're seeing in the society, is definitely a result of the last 20 years and the fact that we survived as a democracy during this time. survived all together, and we are growing. This is unbelievable. Really unbelievable. This is a miracle.
Dalia, please.
I also think that the State of Israel can serve as a model of really Jewish achievement, because really what we have done in every aspect is miraculous. We are talking about our problems because we are concerned about the present, and we want to take the measures to invest in the future, and we always want better future for our children and our grandchildren. This is why we're talking about the inner problems of the Israeli society, and we do have, but no doubt that as a society that was accepting so many immigrants, it's a miracle what we did, especially with the Russians. It was a difficult immigration. They were very stubborn about their tradition and culture and language. A lot of the Russians refused to speak Hebrew. They have their newspapers and channels on TV in Russian. But as Eliezer Yari just said, the young generation does it. And it takes another generation and another generation, and patience and hope to see the integration. And I think that the army serves as the greatest tool, the greatest means of integrating different immigrations. And I think what is being done within the army, education-wise and integration-wise, has also to serve as a symbol, because it's great work, and when they come and when they fight together, they are equal, and they get together and they get to know each other's problems, and chemistry does it, personal touch does it, and then they become one nation. And if you spoke about this movie before, you had the examples there of Russian immigrants together with the Moroccan guy being for 2.5 years in those terrible ditches, living in the ditches, under shelling, losing friends. This brings them together. So I think that the army serves a very, very important integrating tool.
Okay, that's. I'm glad that we're ending on an encouraging note. And I should stress, I think that this panel took its subject very seriously and took you very seriously, and we didn't give you the platitudes, and I think it was all the richer for it. Just as a final question to each of you, and you've got about half a minute to answer. A bottom line question: is the Zionist spirit of the state still alive? Is there still a sense of national mission? Now, you may feel, Dalia, that you kind of answered that already, but if you want to have your half a minute, I won't stop you. In any order you like, just give me your sort of summing up sense of where we stand. Eliezer, you look almost ready to speak, so I'm going to pick on you first. Yeah.
No, I'm a storyteller. Let me tell you a little story again.
A very little story.
Very little story. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to a show in Tel Aviv. It's not a show, it's an industrial show where people, it's a kind of, how do you say it? A fair for industrialists. And my brother-in-law, he inherited the carpentry that my father-in-law had, who was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, and the fact that he was a carpenter saved his life. And he started this little workshop in Rehovot. And when he died, he had 4 people working for him. Today, they have 20 people working there. And he's selling special equipment for laboratories and carpentry for laboratories of genetic engineering and things I don't know anything about. And I met there a woman from Germany. And I asked her, what are you doing here? I said, I came to see the exhibition. I said, why? He said, if you're in this industry today in the world, there's one place you cannot not be in, and this is Tel Aviv. The most important place in our industry of genetic engineering, whatever, the most important place is Tel Aviv. And I thought about my father-in-law, the carpenter from Poroslo, Hungary, that his son has this factory now that is working actually on things that will create the jobs 20 years from now, I said, he succeeded.
Okay. Efrat, did you want to just give a little sort of summary on that final question?
I'll start with the good part. The government is really allocating a large amount of money for the North and for the South. We're talking about $1 billion for the years 2007 and 2008, and we're talking about, help me out, how much is 17 billion shekels in dollars?
Like $4 billion.
$4 billion.
$4 billion over the period of 10 years for the Negev. So we really are going to invest, and we're starting it right now in the Negev and the Galil. About Zionism, I believe that we're facing great challenges right now, but I believe that in a time of great challenges, as Zionists, we should live up to them. We can live up to them with our innovation, with our skills, with the Aliyah, with our ability to do it together, because I believe that together we stand, and in fighting we fall, and here we're standing together. And I'll finish with the story that Shimon Peres told me about Ben Gurion. He told me that pessimists and the optimists die the same way. They only live a different life. So I believe that in this room we should be the optimists. Thank you very much.
Dalia, so a final short summary.
I hate to be the party pooper. I also would love to be optimist, but I think there is a Zionist spirit, but we face a very serious problem of leadership, and this will affect the volunteering and the ability of next generations to do more, to sacrifice. Our leadership has to set better model, I think, to my opinion.
Okay. I get a wrap?
You get to wrap, Seth, yeah.
I'm the only one here that I think that wasn't born
That
in
was a
Israel.
real Zionist.
Yeah.
Excuse me, you and me both.
I always tell
And you
people.
did.
Yeah.
That's right.
I always tell people that I made Aliyah at night, but not last night. And I've seen a lot going on in Israel. I came to Israel with very little money in my pocket. I built a business from nothing, went from 2 people to 200 people. I successfully sold that company to an American publicly traded company. So I'm a Zionist success story, but I wasn't really a Zionist. I want to tell you that the Zionist spirit is absolutely alive today in Israel. And I've seen it in Project Nimrat and in Israel Critical Capital. I have people in my organization who have moved from the center of Israel, from Tel Aviv, to live outside Rosh Pinah in housing that we provide in Kibbutz Kfar HaNasi. And they live there as moved from Tel Aviv up to the north. I have a group of top Army, Navy officers who all went through elite Navy training and continue to serve as elite Navy officers. And when Nimrat started to go and we started to recruit some new people, one of them called his friend who was studying, who just finished a master's, an MBA in Germany, in Hamburg, I believe, and he said, "You have to come back to Israel now. This is the real thing." And this guy came back to Israel from Germany and is now leading the project at Nimrat. That's Zionism. I have people in Nimrat, we have worked hard 24 hours around the clock building the office to make sure that we were ready to serve the population right after the war. And one of our business consultants happens to be a certified electrician as well. And he was staying after the shift, midnight, 2 in the morning, stringing lights across our open space and building, making sure that the networks were working on the computers. When I came up, I called him aside and I said, "Yuval, I have to thank you. I mean, the work you're putting in here and you're not getting paid, the overtime, unbelievable. For 40 minutes, this person would not let me out of the room and thanked me for giving him the opportunity to participate in such a project. He thanked me for reviving hope. He tells me he's 4th generation Kiryat Shmona. You saw Kiryat Shmona in the film before. 4th generation. The schools are no good. The mayor is corrupt. All the stories. And he's thanking me for giving him this chance that he could work around the clock and not see his family. So to me, I have taken out of my own project, my cynicism has been switched to, first of all, a very warm feeling of Zionism, and I go back to my original point, which is the search for new meaning, a new dictionary, new terminology that will enable us to look forward into it. And there is a new Zionism, and we just have to understand it.
Thank you, Seth. I'll just say, as the other person up here who chose to live in Israel, raising young kids in Israel who laugh at my Hebrew, who won't let me write notes to their teachers to explain anything because there'll be so many spelling mistakes in them. There is something, I don't know, in the water, in the spirit, in the essence of Israel. We are somehow, despite all the challenges, producing the most extraordinary people. And it's fantastic to live there. And I want to thank the members of our panel for their information, for their passion, and for their candor. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your support and for your partnership, which is, of course, crucial to our tiny, vibrant, precious, young state of Israel. Thank you very, very much.